Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the High Dragon's Breath Bow Wow, and welcoming you back to another Archon's Armory. Today we will be discussing the oh so vaunted and anticipated bolter, the bolt gun, bolt weapons in general, and celebrating an oh so very special 100 plus subscriber special. Now I've been teasing this video for a while now, and it's going to be a long one, so settle in, make yourselves comfortable, and listen up, 'cause I have a lot to spit at you. Let's start off with the mythos. Now, I will be going over several different patterns of bolter during this video, and various types, and I'll be reading them off as we go. So, let's start off at the top. The pinnacle of human engineering. There's a very common misconception that the bolter is simply the best thing available to the Imperium in terms of individual combat weapon. I would argue that not only is this incorrect, but it is also a dramatic oversimplification. For, of course, there are more complicated technological and more impressive personal infantry weapons in the Imperium. The real thing is that the bolter strikes a lovely middle ground between impressive human engineering, born from the creations of the Dark Age of technology and borne out by the Imperium's history through the Great Crusade, and relative economic value. What does that mean? It means what can the Imperium reliably produce in terms of an infantry weapon that can provide for Space Marines. Now, speaking of which, the second myth, Space Marines only. This is a very common idea that, new people to the hobby might have, that bolters are simply too large and too brutal to be wielded by any force other than Space Marines. Time was, back in the day during the old lore, that bolt weapons were all over the galaxy in the hands of many different Xenos and humans, but nowadays they are relegated to elite weapons for humans and the main armament of the Adeptus Astartes, the Space Marines. Finally, moving on to what I would call a bit of a controversy. A gun for any occasion versus the oh-so-vaunted holy relics. Now, a lot of the discussions that we have during this video and subsequent videos on Space Marines will be an argument between sensationalism and realism. As you know from my previous videos, I tend to err on the side of realism. There are many holy relics in the Imperium's armories, but a standard bolt gun is far from one. It may be the infantry weapon of the oh-so-vaunted Astartes, but the weapon itself, without any history, is no more than that, in my opinion. Just a gun. And of course, to say that it is a gun for any occasion in itself is a bit of a myth, as, like any standard infantry weapons, it wouldn't be a gun if it didn't have things it couldn't deal with. So, that we will be getting into in depth, because we'll be talking about what qualifies a bolt gun as a holy relic versus a standard infantry weapon. Stats, statistics, extrapolations, and bias. This is more of a byword for what is the history of the bolter and its existence than anything else. Many people have made determinations upon the bolter's existence, its lore, its logic, its internal consistency that has really been ravaged by the authors over time. People treat the bolt gun like it's some sort of impossible, inconceivable, monstrous weapon. At the same time, they need to make some mistakes in their books and in their games. The bolt gun can't simply kill everything that exists in life. So we will be going very deep into what really grounds the weapon in reality, giving comparisons and, relative examples in the realism side of things. And of course, the bolter's lore, while it may be extensive in terms of patterns and famous in terms of its effects, much of the actual physical lore is going to be based on extrapolations. Now, you might say that I am being biased here, but in fact, that bias warning is actually in relation to the extant mental image that most people have of the bolt gun. It is viewed as that ultimate weapon, that holy relic, that thing that makes a space marine a space marine. And really, who could argue with such a large, heavy, angry sounding weapon as the bolt gun? Of course, it embodies the old Firstborn, my favorite Marines, and it really does lend credence to the idea that the Space Marine has earned his position as the most elite infantry in the Imperium. And I will endeavor at every step and with every breath left in my body to try and delete the inherent bias that has come of this concept. So we will be going into that in depth during this video. I expect this video to be at least 2 hours long, so hold on to your horses as we'll be taking a while here. Finally, timeless design, modifiable, or dead-end design. Now this really comes into that extrapolations. The bolt gun during a large period of the Imperium's history did not undergo any modification. Now, it had various forge worlds that produced it, and it had various patterns, but those patterns were relatively static. They did not take too much modification, and the modern bolt gun, in comparison to the Heresy bolt gun, is really the same thing with a slightly improved mechanical suite and an increased profile. These black casings in place of the original Phobos and Umbra pattern, which are much simpler and have much more chrome steel than the black coverings of modern designs. I would call that a timeless design. The bolt has not changed. The magazines have not changed. The fire pack has not changed. The barrel has not changed. The recoil operation system has not changed. The only thing that has changed over time, for the most part, excluding the modern lore, which we will be going into during a discussion upon bias, we will have to examine that in a few slides, but the real question is it timeless? Does it ever change? Can you modify the design? How far can you modify it? And is the bolter a dead-end design? Now, you might say, it doesn't need improvement, it's perfect as it is. But it is clear that the bolt gun has enemies in the Imperium that it cannot simply overcome with brute force alone. And improvements to the bolt gun, as much as they have been sought over the years, of course excluding the modern lore, which we'll be going into, it has not changed much. This implies that there is either a limitation to the design which prevents it from being improved all that much more, which I would actually agree with, because the lore of the Imperial technology is that most forces are using the best possible compromise between extant technology, discovered technology, and what limited innovation the Cult Mechanicus can afford. So, dead-end design in this case is not actually a bad thing. The bolt gun is really not all that bad. It's quite a capable weapon, but it is not the mythological kill-anything button that many fans think it is. So, let's go to the patterns here. Up top, we have what I would call the most prototypical bolter in all of existence, the Godwin pattern. Much like the Godwin Ultima, its cousin, it has the most standard layout: a heavy black overcarriage, a large ported barrel, a large barrel handhold, essentially a foregrip for the Marine, 30 to 25 round sickle magazine, and a pistol grip. Fairly short barrel, really only 10 to 12 inches, depending on, the scale of the weapon, whether it's human or space marine. And then down here to the Mark III. I would call the Mark III the slightly uglier cousin of the Godwin. It is common, it is relatively short, and it is designed to be a Godwin writ small. They are very efficient, and in my opinion, the Mark III is a little bit prettier than the original Godwin, though not the Godwin Ultima, which is one of my absolute favorite patterns next to the Umbra pattern. Moving on to the reality of the bolter. It is a standard Space Marine armament. So the Adeptus Astartes are equipped with a bolt gun as their regular weapon. It's what they train with, it's what they become most specialized in using, and it is in no way a specialty weapon only for the Space Marines. Most other units do not use bolt guns as their main weapons. A vast majority of them will utilize other infantry weapons, but for Space Marines, the bolt gun is the standard. Now, minor modifications versus impossible redesign. I'll be continuing into this in other slides, but for minor modifications, as you can see, even from the first two slides, there are many different patterns of bolter. And these range from kind of old-fashioned, really utilitarian, function over form style bolters that are very blocky and like these two here have kind of square fixed positions that are not really as smooth or even firearm like necessarily. They look almost more like industrial tools, but in general they look more less polished than the modern redesigns. Now, impossible redesign. It is, of course, assumed in the 41st millennium that technology is massively restricted. The Adeptus Mechanicus, of course, inherently restrict technology with their dogma and their refusal to improve upon extant designs for the risk of damaging the machine spirit or risking their souls to tech heresy. But the bolt gun has had so many different designs over the years that really didn't provide it any more advantage. So when I say impossible redesign, it really means that the core aspect that makes a bolt gun is its ammunition, and that itself is almost impossible to change. Now, you can make weapons that work better or work worse around it, that have different functions, or that are modifications on the original design, but these are variants. They are patterns. They are local, quirky designs. They are not true redesigns. They are not real improvements upon the base concept. Now, let's get to a little bit of hard numbers here, or at least as hard as I can make them, considering that this gun has about as much statistics behind it as the average train ride through downtown New York City. Which is to say, not a lot, other than weight and displacement. Now, weight. The bolt gun is heavy. It's a full steel weapon. And even its casing, while it may look like some sort of complex composite, is likely going to be made of solid steel as well. There are many reasons for this. Adding weight to the gun helps with its recoil management, and while it makes it very difficult for a regular mortal to pick up and use an Astartes bolt gun, it does allow the Astartes to fire his weapon with slightly less recoil. If the gun was considerably lighter, made of some sort of thick composite, it not only has a chance of bucking considerably more violently than it does regularly, but also has a much higher chance of breaking. Space Marine combat is, if anything, not gentle, and using your bolt gun as a club or as a defensive attack against some surprise attack by a chainsword or something like that, the bolt gun may even survive. So it is a brute's weapon. It is heavy, it is thick, and it is durable. Standards for the bolt gun. Almost all bolt guns are produced by Forge Worlds. Matter of fact, a vast majority of the designs available are named after Forge Worlds. So they are made to the highest available standard when they come originally. That is not to say that certain other happenstances or events may cause them to fall below perfect maintenance or replacement scales or numbers, but in their standard configuration, let's say out of the box, the bolt gun is going to be one of the highest quality weapons available within the Imperium of Man. Finally, replacement. And I've just put difficulty there because replacing a bolt gun is hard. Not only is the gun 3 to 7 times the average weight of an infantry weapon for a infantryman, it is also more expensive in terms of high quality materials, mostly for its barrel and for its sights. It requires a great deal of mechanization and computerization in order to uplink with a Space Marine's helmet and other subsystems. But almost all of its ammunition and many of its internal parts will be made of high-grade adamantium and other rare materials. So while the bolt gun itself may be of simple steel, and in many cases very high-grade steel, the ammunition and some of the internal components are going to be made of much more complicated and probably much more expensive materials, making replacement a dissatisfactory concept if a Marine does not have direct access to a Forge World. He may have to make do with a secondary option. Chainswords are always a good option, but, most Marines favor the bolt gun because it is the standard. And finally, training and armament. Training in the bolt gun. For an Adeptus Astartes, this is going to be inherent to their training as a whole. They will be trained first in psycho-indoctrination phases, then they will be trained at arms by their fellow brothers. Finally, they will drill and prepare the weapon themselves, having a personal connection with their bolt gun, but also, in many cases, training with the bolt gun is really a factor of training with your armor. As the bolt gun is meant to be used in conjunction with Space Marine armor in many cases, especially the Astartes bolt guns, the built-in targeter, the heads-up display, and the armor's specific ability to resist recoil are inherently central to the Marine's training. So, when I say that a Space Marine firing a bolt gun without his armor is about as pointless as me firing a high-caliber revolver using only my toes, you can understand that that hyperbole is not necessarily entirely incorrect. There's no point in training them to use the bolt gun if you're not going to train them to use their armor at the same time, because the bolt gun is designed to be resisted by the armor to keep it accurate, or at least as accurate as the bolt gun can be for discussion that we will have in a bit. And finally, armament. We're going to talk about ammunition supply. As mentioned, the ammunition of the bolter, or bolts as it occurs, the kinetic ammunition that comes with the bolt gun, is limited. It requires rare and relatively expensive materials. It requires a high level of quality manufacturing, and that is just to create the ammunition for the bolt gun. That's not to say the weapon itself or the magazines are, all that complicated, but at least the ammo is very expensive. Magazines and backups. Now, I have always held to it that Marines are not intended to be deployed for a great amount of time, and almost all of the lore bears this out. Marines are heavy shock infantry. They're not designed for trench warfare, really. They're not designed for long-term sieges, and when they are, it's because they have no other option. If there is a grinding force like the Iron Warriors used to do, or like the Death Guard used to do, not only, by the way, were they considered, not necessarily inferiors, but they were at least considered unimaginative with their Astartes, using them for this kind of grinding warfare, but Marines in the modern day don't have the luxury of besieging a fortress world for 20 years and losing 5% of their men per year. They simply can't keep up with that attrition rate, both in terms of ammo, in terms of their units, in terms of logistics, and in terms of keeping their numbers high. Marines need to remain, operational in order to get good logistics, because if they're no longer doing things, there's a chance that they may fall out of favor. Not a high chance. They are Marines after all. They have the right to declare that they want or to take something from the rest of the Imperium. But, people who take too much tend to be sanctioned. And sanctions are the death of modern chapters. A similar thing happens with the Chaos Astartes, but in a very different way, where a loyalist chapter may not have the time to equip all of their Marines with, 4 to 6 magazines for an assault. Chaos chapters may not even have 2 or 3 magazines handy. So in general, I keep it that each Marine likely has at least 2 magazines in reserve for their bolt gun. This gives them, on average, if we're talking 30 bolts per magazine, around 90 rounds of ammunition. Now you might say that's not a lot of ammo, that's only 90 people. Correct. But the thing is, Space Marines always have a backup, and the bolt gun is very capable of killing more than one person with a shot. You have to be careful with it, but as Marines aren't expected to engage for hours and hours with mass numbers of enemies, like trench warfare or like open warfare even, Space Marines are aimed in decapitating strikes, they're organized to break enemy resistance and then allow in other forces. Only when you have an entire chapter or a large portion of a chapter engaged in a single battle theater do you see extended running gun battles occurring between Astartes and their enemies, and that's where that kind of 90 to 120 round bolt gun capacity can really become an issue because, well, you're assuming that they hit every single shot, which is very unlikely with a bolt gun. So let's say that every Marine can probably account for bare minimum 90 opponents killed without any risk to themselves in terms of ranged combat necessarily, unless the opponent is very well equipped with armor-piercing weaponry. They're still going to have to rely upon a secondary or backup weapon, and we'll go over that in a bit with bolt pistols and with close combat weapons. But again, ammunition supply, magazines, and backups, I say that every Marine has between 3 and 4 magazines, including the one in their bolt gun, which brings them to roughly between 90 and 120 rounds total per engagement. Obviously, they can get resupply. Obviously, Marines can carry more than that. The big issue is just what they can carry on their person, how much weight they're willing to endure, and how many rounds they're going to need for the conflict. If they really, really need extra, I'm sure they can lug around more, but on average, I'm going to say during deployment, 90 to 120 bolts is going to be more than enough most of the time. Now, the pros and cons of the... I've forgotten to go over our patterns here. First up, these are both Heresy-era bolt guns. One of them is one of my absolute favorites, the Phobos style of bolt gun. It has a very beautiful exposed barrel with 2 ports instead of 1 and 2 top ports. It has that similar kind of recoil compensator down below and the vision block up above that attaches to the camera to the HUD. It has large exposed magazine with empty kind of almost like sweetheart grips on the mag that have been removed. An enormous magazine catch release, a large and slightly elevated shell ejection sight, and the very classic back end of the bolter, which has the circle. To go into this a little bit, the bolt gun is a mostly recoil or a recoil-assisted reload system, which means that it is essentially a straight blowback weapon. Now you might say that's very, brutalist for a weapon of this type. And I would say, yes, it absolutely is. The bolt gun being a recoil-operated firearm really just makes it so that the gun has insane amounts of recoil while keeping it incredibly small. Whatever springs or complex recoil system they have back here is assisted by the sheer weight of the barrel and the 2-stage nature of the ammunition, which we'll go over later. So, up top we have the Phobos pattern, and down bottom we have the Tigris pattern. The Tigris is similar to the Phobos. It has the same cutout. It has an underbarrel kind of holding area for the Marine's hand, which the Phobos does not have. The Phobos is older than the Tigris, which is why it has a lot of the kind of quality of life pieces removed. It has a much larger pistol grip, kind of better for Astartes to grip, and the recoil mechanism for the Tigris is even larger than the Phobos, which I think has to do with the Phobos having extra vents, allowing it to shoot more gases forward instead of relying on them to recoil. The larger recoil apparatus of the Tigris is likely as a result of its increased size, smaller barrel, and fewer ports on said barrel. And of course the Tigris in this case has a straight pull magazine as opposed to the curved Phobos magazine. Again, much more classic, older Heresy pattern Phobos. Tigris, while it does exist in the Heresy, it is a much more modern pattern, and while I like them both, I do prefer the Phobos. Pros and cons of the bolt gun / the bolter. I do not discriminate in this review between the bolt gun, which is referred to as the kind of shorter heresy and pre-heresy guns, which are a mix of like proto bolt guns and, you know, what would eventually become modern bolters, and the bolter. The bolter is the standard Space Marine armament up to the 41st millennium. Before that period, bolters were the standard. They were the short bolt-firing weapons, whereas the bolt gun was kind of this intermediary step that started off the Great Crusade and then eventually evolved into the bolter over a series of, evaluations, changes, modifications, improvements by the Adeptus Mechanicus, etc. So, pros and cons. A con is absolutely the expense. The bolt gun in itself requires a great deal of metal. They are large, they are hard to make. The patterns for them are jealously guarded by the Adeptus Mechanicus. Bolt guns are worth so much money in providing the Adeptus Astartes, It isn't necessarily that the Adeptus Astartes are paying a lot. It's more like every weapon given to the Adeptus Astartes from a Forge World is almost like a tax write-off for the Adeptus Mechanicus, because if they point to a chapter and say, we provided them with 40 different bolt guns this year, and you'd say that to the Adeptus Administratum or the Munitorum, they will absolutely be like, oh, you have provided a ton of weapons for the Adeptus Astartes? Great, here's your tax write-off. Go ahead and do this what you would like with this free money. But for the chapters involved, it is expensive to replace. Again, not necessarily that they have to pay for it. Some of them likely do. Though it is also the fact of the bolt gun itself to replace and to create is expensive, including the ammunition. So definitely a con is the sheer expense, both, inherent in terms of money for production and in terms of, debt owed to a Forge World because they made your entire chapter new bolt guns or provided you with ammunition for the last 40 years. They could absolutely leverage that against you. And it would be very likely that a Forge would want to do so just for the fact that if the Administratum isn't doing what they want them to do, they could simply have the Adeptus Astartes put in a good word on their behalf. There is this very strong, coercive honor culture, production culture between providing for the Adeptus Astartes and essentially strong-arming the Adeptus Administratum to ensure that Forge Worlds come out on top in this negotiation. Finally, recoil versus accuracy. Now, the bolt gun is famous for its severe, almost violent recoil. And this has to do with its recoil operation system, how in order to fire the next round, it has to kick very violently in order to throw back its very heavy bolt, open its chamber, eject the shell, and then load a second shell. So the recoil operation is one of those reasons, but the other one that I want to bring into play is recoil versus accuracy. So does recoil negatively affect accuracy? Yes, but I would actually argue that the bolt gun doesn't care much about accuracy beyond around 250 to 500 meters. And I'll say why that is in a bit when we discuss how the bolter works, but I suggest that the absolute maximum range of the bolt gun is around 500 meters, at which point you would no longer expect a standard bolter to be able to hit a man-sized target with any level or degree of accuracy. There's a lot of reasons for that, but the main one is I don't just blame the recoil, because not only can the recoil be tamed by a two-handed grip, by bracing the weapon, and even by using it in semi-automatic mode to get a little bit more accuracy out of it, but there is another reason, which is the volatility of the ammunition and the design of the ammunition in general limits its accuracy, I say, to around 500 meters. So around half or 65% of the range of the average human infantry weapon, the bolt gun will begin to lose far more accuracy than the standard infantry weapon will. Alright, now, I would call that mostly a con. The semi-armor piercing, I put a question mark here because it is questionable, quite frankly. The bolt gun has a lot of things going for it. It uses a very high caliber round in comparison to most infantry weapons. It uses a fully kinetic round instead of the energy weapons used by the Imperial Guard. And while it is destructive, and it has a onboard warhead in terms of, having an explosive in its shell, it is most definitely a shell and not just a bullet. I argue with the idea whether it is semi-armor piercing. Some people say that it's pure armor piercing because it has an armor piercing tip. We will go into that when we come to the design of the bolt shell itself. But I think for now, I'm going to leave it as a both pro and con. It is capable of penetrating armor, especially light armor, but it is arguable whether the bolt gun is actually well suited for this role because of the bolt shell itself. As I said, we will come to that in depth very soon. So, semi-armor piercing, I'm going to put that as neutral. It can do the job. It is capable, very capable in many cases, but it has failings that I think are heavily overlooked because of the mythology around the weapon. Weight relative to ammunition capacity. Again, as I said, most bolt guns do not hold more than 45 rounds of ammunition. And even with that, you're using oversized magazines. There are magazines for the bolt gun that only hold 20 rounds. Considering that this is a weapon that can fire fully automatic, that is a very limited ammunition capacity. And even for those, I would expect a Marine to carry maybe 4 extra magazines on their person. That limits them to only 100 rounds. 5 20-round straight pull magazines, 100 bullets. That's even less than the 35 or 30 round banana magazines. And the weapon is heavy, it's weighty. If you're not in power armor, carrying around 30 to 100 rounds, carrying around 90 to 120 rounds is going to weigh upward of 20 pounds. That is a huge amount of kit, not to mention the gun itself likely weighs 2 times more than that. I would argue that an Astartes bolt gun weighs somewhere in the range of 45 pounds, while the standard human bolt gun would probably weigh above 30 pounds, roughly, unloaded. And, that may not sound like a ton, but for an infantry weapon, that is 3 times as heavy as you want an infantry weapon to be. And it is at least 6 times as heavy as some versions of lasgun. So, this becomes a real issue. How much ammunition can you carry until the point where the gun is too heavy and the ammo is too heavy for you to reasonably operate anymore? Carrying 500 rounds of bolt ammunition is going to be infeasible even for a Marine. Even with their strength, carrying that many magazines is just impossible. It is too heavy. It will limit their movement. It will not be tactically sound. Now, while they may physically be able to do it, that doesn't mean that it is the right thing to do. So I would put that as a con. Finally, durability and reliability. As mentioned, the bolt gun is made to the absolute highest available standard, which means that durability-wise, being a full steel firearm, given that there are no wear issues, wear and tear, while it is a steel-on-steel firearm, which means that it's going to have more resistance and friction between its parts, these parts are of the highest possible quality, and many of them that have wear and tear are made of adamantium, deuterium, depleted uranium. It's very tough stuff. Probably not the actual frame of the weapon is made of depleted uranium, but, adamantium, absolutely. Adamantine material, absolutely. I could see many of the wear and tear parts being made out of much denser, heavier, harder, tougher metals because the bolt gun needs to be durable. It needs to be used and taken care of, and it can't just be set aside for repair. Marines won't often have a backup option, at least not one of equivalent quality. So it's durability and reliability. Now this becomes an issue. Durability, absolutely. The bolt gun is great. I'd give that a 100% pro. It's durable, it's heavy, it's tough, it's reliable. It is reliable, asterisk, but it's questionable whether all bolt guns are made with the same standard, or More importantly, if they have remained maintained to the same standard. What does that mean? Not only do you have bolt guns in the hands of humans who might not know how to directly maintain them correctly, guard sergeants can get their hands on bolt weapons, commissars obviously will get their hands on bolt weapons all the time, but more importantly, certain regiments do use the bolt gun as a special weapon. This isn't common, but it can happen. The issue becomes how well you're taking care of it and how good the ammunition is that you're loading into it. Because the ammunition, unlike the bolt gun itself, doesn't have to be made on Forge Worlds. We know, for example, that certain Space Marine chapters will maintain and repair their bolt guns themselves and will produce some of their own ammunition. Now, while I don't say that some Space Marines are not incredible craftsmen, and they have a great deal of quality and capability, a Marine-crafted bolt shell is likely going to be inferior to the one made on a Forge World. If for no other reason, then the Space Marine one likely has to be made on ship, with shipboard limitations in terms of technology, quality control, and the access of tech priests. Because often, as is common with loyalist Space Marines, holy events like the creation of weaponry or the blessing of ammunition can be closed to the Adeptus Mechanicus, and there's not much that they can do about it. So a chapter could, theoretically, be making equipment, including ammunition, that is of substandard quality, and the Mechanicus really couldn't do much about it other than, complain, which is a very common thing that they do. And this becomes doubly true with Chaos. Obviously, Chaos's production and Forge Worlds are even more limited and even more restricted in terms of quality control, if it even exists, than the Loyalists are, which can cause certain bolt guns to have some questionable reliability. And finally, we get into caliber issues. Now, this has been absolutely one of the things that I have staked the lore statement on. I'm going by what the lore says. What we have had confirmed to us in books or in information beforehand. The human caliber bolter, so the ones used by Sisters of Battle, and the ones that are given out to the Imperial Guard, whether they are bolt pistols or bolters themselves, so either the rifle or the pistol variant, are .60 caliber, which is 15 millimeters. That may sound remarkably small, but it is not, believe me. 15 millimeters is larger than a 50 cal. 15 millimeters is larger than the largest heavy machine gun that is available in the modern day that isn't considered an autocannon. Matter of fact, when we did our autocannon video, remember very clearly that 15 millimeters was both the absolute top end of heavy stubbers and the lowest range of autocannons. So the human bolt gun is effectively firing what we would consider an autocannon caliber round. We will discuss why it does not perform at the same level, but for the moment, understand that the human bolt guns are going to be around 15 millimeters in width. The Marine bolt gun is larger, of course, and their pistols are larger, of course, and obviously, by the way, the pistols will hold less rounds. The magazine relations that I'm using are for the bolt gun itself. The Marine bolt gun is a 20 millimeter. Again, I have extrapolated these kind of rounded around to the correct millimeter size. Many rifles, and especially cannons, will say that they're 1 caliber, and in reality the round is slightly smaller or sometimes slightly larger. So .75 caliber is the standard Marine number for how big their rounds are. That's around 20 millimeters. A 20 millimeter round is a medium cannon round. It is essentially an autocannon round that is in an infantry weapon. So, sounds very impressive. Again, we'll go over it when we talk about how the bolter works in a second. But for the Marine, it's 5 millimeters larger than the human, which means that not only is it firing a larger caliber round, increasing the violence of the recoil, but it is also carrying more fuel and carrying more punch in terms of its explosive. And finally, the heavy/heavy plus. Now, .95 is the best the best modern day equivalent for what these are. .959 or 955 JDJ, the Fat Mac rifles that exist today, are in my opinion the best modern equivalent to what a heavy bolter would be firing. They range anywhere between 26 and 40 millimeters. I say 40 millimeters, those are definitely going to be on the side of weapons used by tanks and weapon used by Imperial Knights. These are very much still medium autocannon calibers coming out of a bolt gun. So while they are small in terms of the weapons and the weapon systems that they fit on top of, even the heavy bolter is only around 26 millimeters, which, while it sounds impressive, carries a lot less high explosive than you might think it does. And when you consider something like a 40 millimeter grenade launcher that we have in our modern day, only the absolute top end of the bolter's size is going to be equivalent to that in terms of destructive power. And even then, those are designed for high explosive, whereas the bolter is this hybrid, semi-armor piercing, semi-high explosive warhead. So the heavy bolter, around 26 millimeters. So now we come to the pictures on the right. I am aware this is going to take a while. Believe me, we've just gotten started. On the top left is the Umbra pattern bolt gun. This is one of my absolute favorite weapons in 40k. It is simple, it is basic, it has a massive barrel and muzzle brake, almost comically oversized, but it is so slim and cut down for a bolt weapon that it almost looks like it's designed for humans, whereas it is very much a Horus Heresy era and post-Heresy era design that is, a cut-down, simpler version of the bolter that is easier to produce. One of my favorite things about the Umbra pattern and the Parenti Solo, which is also on here, is that it is proof that the bolt gun has cheaper kind of budget derivatives that Marines can use if they want to buff up the number of people in their chapter who has a bolt gun, or, more importantly, if they want a backup. And I could really see this being a backup. The Umbra is reliable. It might not be as fancy as the other bolt guns, but it is very much a standard bolt weapon. Finally, to the last two, we get the Godwin Diaz. The Godwin Diaz is the best example that we have of a cannon human bolt weapon. It is a 60 caliber, full auto and semi-auto capable. Again, most bolt guns are capable of full auto fire and semi-auto. The Parenti Solo being an interesting standout exception. But the Godwin Diaz is designed for the Adeptus Sororitas, the Sisters of Battle, our nuns with guns. So, they are of lower caliber, they have lower recoil, they have... I've had questionable information about how big the magazines are. In general, human bolt guns are going to have a larger magazine capacity, just because the bullets that they have are 5 millimeters smaller than the Marine ones, so you can fit in somewhere between 10 and 20% more ammunition. So whereas a large Space Marine bolt gun magazine may only hold 40 rounds, the Godwin Diaz may hold 60. This is very helpful. Because the Godwin Diaz does have fully automatic fire, and with Sororitas having power armor, essentially, they're able to control the recoil of this small and very violent weapon as it rattles off 60 rounds of bolt gun at their opponents. The Parenti Solo is a relatively odd design. It is a cheaper, cut-down version of the bolt gun. It is only capable of semi-automatic fire, and while it uses a standard human bolt round, it is 20 box round mag only, so only 20 rounds per magazine, and it is really designed as this kind of budget bolt gun. And while it is for humans, I could very much see a human sniper or a human heavy weapons operator or even a sergeant using the Parenti Solo, because it offers that middle area of I have an infantry weapon, which is lighter than a heavy weapon like an autocannon, but it provides a similar punch at 15 millimeters, even though it's semi-automatic. And semi-automatic isn't really much of a downside if you're fighting humans, and a majority of the time, 1 or 2 rounds is going to put down your opponent for good. So let us move on. how the bolter works. Now, this is really the big one, and you can see I have a lot of material on this slide. It will take me a while to go over this, but I will do my best to ensure that it is logical and legible. Let's get over the easy parts first. Who makes what? Obviously, forges make a vast majority of bolt guns. While I do agree that, local/chapter production can make ammunition and modifications, a majority of the guns themselves and any variants therein or thereof are going to come from forges. Forges have, pieces and bits of STCs for bolt guns, and while they may produce them using, traditional methods of design and creation, many of them do have genuine designs that have over the years become, equivalent to STC. So they've gotten, this piece can be made by a standardized construct. Okay, cool. This piece can be made by this standardized construct. We make them together. We mate them using the technological and mechanical know-how that we have. Boom, local bolt gun design. And the variants are the same. When you get to the Storm Bolter, Stalker Bolter, etc., you're going to have that same thing of, well, the Forge makes this, they make this, they're going to mate this idea with this idea and create an official variant for the bolt gun there. Local and chapter production, this more has to do with industrial worlds that may make bolter ammunition, and also with the heavy bolter, because while the bolt gun itself may be limited to forge worlds, the bolter, or the heavy bolter, is not. It is one of the most common support weapons in the Imperium of Man for the Astra Militarum, for the Imperial Guard. Now, this really isn't too much of an issue for the Mechanicus. The heavy bolter has a lot of modifications. It's a very simple weapon compared to the more compact and complex bolt gun, and it uses a much larger caliber, making it, easier to produce. You don't have to have as many small, intricate technological machines or mechanical know-how to produce the heavy bolter, since it is made on a scale almost twice the size of the standard bolt gun. So forges do not begrudge the heavy bolter too harshly. And the local production of the heavy bolter is also accompanied by local produced ammunition, chapter-based ammo production and modification. So, of course, the Adeptus Mechanicus knows that once the bolt gun is in the hands of the Astartes, there's very little that they can do to ensure that they are, kept up to Mechanicus standards. Many chapters, and originally even some legions, would modify the bolt gun to fit their needs. This is most famous with the Wolves of Fenris. The Space Wolves would add skulls to their bolt guns, and they would put runes on them. There were many chapters that would put heraldry or modifications. The Blood Angels, for example, have many gilded bolt guns with gems or beautiful icons on them. I'm sure the Adeptus Mechanicus did not appreciate this. I am sure that they did everything in their power to tell them to stop, but I am also entirely aware that the legions probably told them to stuff themselves, and continued anyway, and that has not changed in the modern 41st millennium, and with Chaos Forces, it becomes even more radical and wild. So, that's local chapter versus forge production. Now on to the nitty-gritty, and this is where I really have to take a minute to focus with you guys. The bolt shell design is a rocket-propelled, or a semi-rocket propelled, semi-rocket propelled, semi-armor-piercing, low-yield explosive shell. That is the best way that I can explain it. A low-yield explosive shell. The bolt design is a two-stage cartridge. Now you can see it here, what I have up here. At the back is this kind of two-section cartridge, the very rear of which is filled with propellant. Whatever that propellant may be, irrelevant. The rear end is propellant. The second line is where the shell itself ends. So the front half of the shell, the part that is visible, this kind of bronze-looking semicircle, that is the warhead. That is what strikes the opponent and has explosive within it. These tubes and the area underneath here, that is the rocket part of the shell. And inside of it, and partially in this second chamber, is the projectiles, what I call the booster charge. So, What happens when you fire a bolt gun? And up here I have for reference a 20 millimeter grenade launcher from South Africa. It's a PAW 20 millimeter to give you a reference as to, the size of bolt shells. Obviously, bolt shells, because they aren't using entirely kinetic means, they're also using rocket means. They don't look as long or have as short of a thing, but just for reference. Now, the bolt shell is designed to have the booster charge fire, so the shell explodes, the initial push is done, it fires out the shell, and then two things happen. That first charge fires the gun, pushing a huge weight. The shell of the bolter is weighty in comparison to even the heaviest of heavy machine gun rounds. The recoil is violent. It jerks the weapon back. It shoves the recoil spring in reverse. It causes the internal coil to twist, which is what that circular thing is at the back of most bolters. It is a recoil spring, kind of like a leaf spring. It twists, allowing the bolt to pull back, grab another round, ram it forward. As it's doing so, the first round obviously is ejected, and you can see over here, it is ragged and broken because that first charge is what gets the shell clear of the barrel and clear of the user. Now, this is where it gets a little bit murky, and this is where my numbers are reliant on some technological data more than they are upon any, relevant or extant information. As the bolt gun fires, when it leaves the barrel, it is traveling about 500 meters per second. Now, that is slow for a bullet. For a standard infantry rifle, that is well below the speed of a .308 bullet. It is considerably below the speed that you can reach with a .50 caliber round. And you might say, why is it so slow coming out of the barrel? The answer is because it's not done yet. Essentially, the first charge is only used to get it clear of the weapon and clear of the user so that no backblast hurts them. Now, the bolt design fires this whole cartridge, fires the whole rocket, the propellant, the filler, and the penetrator tip out, away. Maybe it's 5 meters, maybe it's 10 meters. It might vary between variants, it might vary between guns and between bolt designs, but whatever distance it is, it goes from 500 meters per second as it leaves the barrel. So all of that push comes to shove, the weapon discharges with a huge amount of violence. It doesn't have much stabilization, as the barrel of almost every bolt gun is very short, less than 16 inches in a majority of cases, and considerably less in some cases, like with the bolt pistol. And as it leaves the barrel, it is traveling somewhere around 500 meters per second. Now again, that is slow compared to a rifle. What happens afterward is most important, though. After I've put X meters there, I would say somewhere between 50 and 30, or between 30 and 100 meters as it's slowing down. Because, of course, 500 meters per second, a shell this slow, it's going to be ejecting and then immediately slowing down as it is large. It's not aerodynamic. It's got a fat head. It's got a very sharp tip. So it's going to be spreading. It's going to get air resistance. It's going to be slowing down. But as it's about to lose its trajectory, essentially, because, of course, ballistic trajectory goes out at a certain distance until the force upon the round slows down due to air pressure enough that it begins to drip or to dip downward. That's why, bullets have drop. Once the drop begins to affect it, and of course, as the bolt is the most old part of the design, this is absolutely perfected. As it's just about to dip, a second stage warhead begins in the bolt's firing. So, this second stage, the rocket of the bolt, essentially fires the whole shell, explosive and all, further. It uses an inbuilt, 2 or 3 channel spinning, rotating rocket motor to accelerate the bolt even faster, even further. So, let's say, for the sake of the argument, you fire a bolt gun at a target within 50 meters. The bolt round isn't going to even start firing the rocket before it hits and detonates. Now, this may mean that the bolt gun at closer range isn't going to be penetrating as much armor. There's an odd in and out effect because the rocket motor accelerates the round as it is slower, not interacting with the barrel on the second stage, and it is also getting continually more and more pressure behind it as, rockets increase the change in velocity, so increases delta V over time until they run out of fuel, which is very short in the bolt gun, but it is fast enough to get it around 850 to 800 meters per second. 800 meters per second is more than respectable for a standard infantry rifle, and with the weight of the bolt shell, this means that it is hitting with an insane amount of force if given the chance to fully accelerate. Now, this has some negative effects upon the shell and its actual accuracy and design, but it has a remarkable effect on how its dynamics work against opponents at different ranges. For example, within that 50 or 35 meter range, that kind of short range where it's just being propelled by its initial charge, it's going to hit a target at a slower speed, but it is going to have more explosive because the fuel for the rockets has not actually detonated yet, and the fuel channels are attached to the main charge. So, under 50 meters, you're going to be hit by a heavy, slow-moving, almost grenade round, which is going to have a whole lot more propellant detonating when the actual warhead or the charge of the bolt shell explodes. So, the explosion under 50 meters is going to be almost more violent than when it strikes an opponent at over 50 meters. Now, when I say that it accelerates the shell beyond 50 meters to up to 800 or 850 meters per second, this is a graph. It's not a consistent, it's not a jump in speed. It doesn't, explode like a rocket or like a bullet and shoot at an increased velocity. It is building up like a rocket, slow change in velocity over time. So, as the fuel, the secondary fuel, is expended, more and more change in velocity is happening, and it is increasing its speed. So the chart almost goes from a straight line, it goes at 500 meters, it slowly decreases, maybe to just under 450 or maybe just above 400 meters per second, and then the second stage of the bolt shell kicks in, and it accelerates from 400 meters per second up to 800 meters per second, and sometimes even beyond. So it almost doubles in acceleration over a period of meters. I would argue somewhere between 500 and 700 meters until the bolt shell will run out of essentially propellant, be flying on its own power, and likely lose aerodynamic stability, fall, tumble, drop to the ground, begin its ballistic arc, and fail to be effective anymore. So, outside of 500 meters, the shell is no longer as effective, and it is also going to be reducing in its lethality as it tumbles, as air pressure begins to slow it down, as the large and kind of clumsy design of the bullet is going to be continually reducing its effectiveness. So, to put that all into more simple words, the bolt gun has an initial charge, accelerates it up to around 500 meters per second for a short distance. It's still got propulsion. Or it's still got propellant in it. Once the propellant ignites at around 50 meters, it accelerates up to 850 meters per second, matching a standard rifle cartridge. It then expends all of that energy, again, going up to its highest possible speed at, I would argue, somewhere around 250 meters. Maybe considerably lower that, maybe around 100 meters, because, of course, rockets do tend to expend their energy rather quickly. So let's say around 150 to 100 meters, it's going to be at its absolute maximum speed because it's been fired, it's slowed down, and then it's spent all of its energy to shoot itself up to the maximum speed possible, and now it is slowing down ever so slightly with wind resistance and with air resistance as it passes through, the oxygen. Now, that means that it has a very crazy graph. It goes from like a slight decline from 500 meters per second to a sharp jump at around 150 meters, and then slowly decreasing until I would argue around 500 to 700 meters, it will be out of steam and it will begin tumbling or falling and become considerably less useful and definitely less accurate. So, that is my understanding and that is my explanation of how the bolt shell itself works. because the bolt shell does most of the pushing, and because of the change in velocity that occurs, the acceleration after the quick acceleration of the primary charge, the deceleration and then reacceleration of the rocket, this means that the bolt gun doesn't need a huge barrel to keep it accurate. It essentially is keeping itself stabilized by spinning with its rocket motor, even though the rocket motor may be a little bit more inaccurate. Now, I'm going to stop with the innovation thing here, and I'm going to come back to that in a second, but let me explain. Here's our pictures over here. We have the 20mm grenade launcher, again, that semi-auto kind of rifle style that we have nowadays. The bolt shell, the standard Marine bolter round. The primary charge, in my opinion, would absolutely shatter some of the shell. So this kind of ragged exit wound that it looks like when it gets ejected from the gun, I think is fairly reasonable, considering the violence of that initial charge, shooting a massive, higher than high caliber machine gun round, essentially, at up to 500 meters per second, right out of a 12-inch barrel. It is a violent, smashing explosion. I wouldn't be surprised if they weren't using so much propellant as they were using solid-state explosives to fire the bolt shell out. I would almost argue that they might use cordite or some sort of similar blasting charge to get it out of there and clear of the barrel before its rocket takes over. The cross-section is where things get interesting, and we'll go over it like this. The cross-section shows what is called the core or tip of the bolt gun. It is this kind of like cantered or cantilevered sectioned tip here. It's in blue and gray on here. Now, this is always referred to as the core of the round, even though it clearly isn't in the center. It is a tip. It is a cap. And anyone who uses shell nomenclature will understand that a cap is the front. It is the first thing impacting the target. It is almost always in the bolt gun, as standard, equipped with a deuterium, depleted uranium, diamantine, or adamantium tip. Whatever 40K-esque high-density material you would like to put at the tip of your bolter, it doesn't matter. Essentially, this is a super dense, intentionally armor-piercing, penetrating tip. This has some issues. Now, originally, armor-piercing shells in our day were also made like this. They had the same idea. Put a hyper-dense material at the very tip of the round and have something else around it. Put a thick metal cap around it, or put a thick metal round that was entirely made of steel, and then put an explosive in its base. The bolt gun has something a little different. It has an armor-piercing tip and then explosive payload. This kind of yellow area here would be half propellant, half payload, so that the shell will explode upon, impacting and theoretically penetrating whatever it's hitting. Sorry. So the issue with this kind of tip versus core issue out of this hyperdense material is that it can do what I call the plink, tink, ding of uncapped ammo versus steel and ceramite. So, in our modern day, we have an issue with sloped and complex convex armor. One of the issues with those early anti-tank weapons is they had difficulty dealing with sloped armor. Why? Because when a super dense material strikes another highly dense material, like face-hardened steel, or in this case, like ceramite, it can plink. It can hit, and the oblique geometry of its impact, aka the angle at which it strikes, can cause it, instead of digging in and penetrating like physics says that it should, the force of its impact hitting the force of the target can cause it to completely deflect. And not only cause the force of the round to be spent, but can also, in the case of the bolter, cause the entire round to be wasted. If the shell plinks off of armor, and this is particularly in vogue with Space Marine armor and with heavy carapace, if there is a thick ceramite or heavy steel layer between the bolt shell and its target, it doesn't have anything to dig into. And if it's not a perfectly 90-degree shot on the armor, it has a solid chance of deflecting or of digging in, smashing the edge of that rounded shell against the armor, and detonating outside of the target. Where the bolt gun wants to penetrate and then detonate, it could accidentally hit, dig into the armor at an angle and then set off its fuse, causing it to explode to relatively low damage to the actual target. Now, this is an issue that comes in with a lot of different weapons in 40k, where a design was thought out, and it had solid ideas at the time. In the 80s and in the 90s when this was a thing, it was the idea that, yes, armor-piercing rounds work so-and-so way, because the bolt gun is almost perfectly designed like a British anti-tank gun of the Second World War, but they are missing a crucial piece, which is the cap. Now, there's a reason why you don't make caps or tips of round out of super dense material. You want to make them out of very soft material, even if it's just soft, mild steel, because a cap allows the shell to collapse a little bit and the hardened penetrator to adjust its angle and bite into the armor. The bolt gun does not have this. The bolt gun has a much higher chance of hitting and clicking with its trajectory and its angle and plinking or tinking or dinging off the target, essentially either digging in, deforming and detonating, or dragging along the armor and exploding or completely missing, or hitting at an angle and simply bouncing entirely. Even off of personal body armor, for all the weight that the bolt gun has, its actual shell is heavy, but if it is aimed incorrectly, or if its tip causes it to change direction violently, and of course because it is a rocket projected round, it's not so much in a perfect straight line. It's going to be affected by the rocket projectile, especially because it is spinning. It is a spin setup rocket. It has a much higher chance of spinning or deflecting off of dense armor, even if it's just face-hardened steel or ceramite. Obviously, the weight overcomes this in many cases with thickness, but particularly with heavy carapace, with medium vehicle armor, and with Space Marine power armor, this becomes a real issue, and you see bolters struggle with these types of protection simply because the bolt shells themselves are working against the concept of the weapon because of this not having a soft tip, and kind of going all in on this. Well, if it hits at 90 degrees, it's got the maximum penetration, and the goal is penetration and then detonation. So, moving on. It's a very complicated concept. I'd love to go into it further, but that's about as much as I can do right now. I'll try and make it clear in the comments if anyone has questions, but believe me, I'm going over this for a long time. It's very complicated, but in simple, it kind of works against itself with this design. While it may seem formidable at first, it actually has a lot of flaws in the way that it actually functions, in reality, or with logic applied to it. Moving on. The bolt roar and the rocket engine ignition. So the bolt roar is essentially that first explosion, that pressure wave and recoil that comes from the initial booster charge of the shell, the one that gets it clear of the barrel. The bolt roar is enhanced by the fact that it is such a large caliber round coming out of such a short barrel. It's spitting fire, it's spraying all types of propellant behind it. It's incredibly loud because the bolt gun is designed with these two holes or several ports on the barrel, designed to not only help mitigate recoil, but it almost increases the report of the bolt gun shell. So the bolt roar, especially when firing fully automatic, can be horrifying and stunning to opponents. Like, oh my goodness, that's so loud. The rocket engine ignition, that's what gives the bolt gun its distinct kind of crack and hiss sound, followed by another crack of the round detonating. So it goes crack from the gun firing, obviously the booster charge firing. It hisses, or in some cases screams, because of the size of the actual propellant tubes. It can scream instead of, hissing, like a normal rocket does. But it whistles, hisses, or crack, or screams, as you like to say it. And then it hits again, and the rocket engine and the round itself is consumed in the explosion. So the weird graph of bolt speed and Y accuracy versus recoil versus armor piercing is strange. So the weird graph of bolt speed is what I was talking about when I say that it is expelled from the barrel at 1 speed. It slows ever so slightly until it hits its second ignition point at 50 meters. And then it accelerates sharply as the rocket pushes it almost as fast or with a similar amount of speed to the initial booster charge, or the primary charge. Sorry. Yeah, the primary charge. Yeah, the booster charge. And as it leaves that second stage, it is going even faster. Now, why I say it's a weird graph, because it kind of goes, slopes a little bit down, shoots up, and then slopes down again, until about 500, 700 meters. Why this is an issue is really when it comes to accuracy versus armor piercing versus recoil. You cannot rely on the bolt gun to penetrate armor that you don't hit at an oblique angle, unless it's very thin. So personal body armor, for the most part, the bolt gun can overcome unless it's very heavy. Even medium armor, you have a chance to survive a standard bolt gun. Human or Astartes, it's not a great chance, but if you can get yourself into a position where you're not taking direct shots, maybe it's coming through a wall, maybe it's hitting you on an angle like a shoulder plate, or it dings you in the helmet. If you can keep it from impacting at a direct angle where its armor-piercing tip can actually get through the armor and can win some purchase and then detonate, that's an issue. But, you might die in that case, but in other cases you have a chance of survival. The big issue with this is that the bolt gun, some people say that it relies on its velocity for its penetration. That's not reliable, because it has two periods of acceleration and two of deceleration. It accelerates out of the barrel, it decelerates after a certain point, and then it re-accelerates again at, I say, around 50 meters. It could be somewhere between 35 and 50, could be higher than 50, I'm not entirely sure, it isn't clear. But this second acceleration point is rapid, it is violent, and the other important part is that it is practically uncontrolled. There's no barrel turning the round. There is no containment preventing it from, malfunctioning. Rockets are horribly inaccurate. In general, there is no control over the bolt shell once it leaves the barrel. Like almost every firearm, but the issue with the bolt gun is that it fires with the standard acceleration of a firearm, and then it re-accelerates itself using a rocket motor. This becomes an issue because while theoretically the best possible place to strike an armored enemy would be right at the height of that 850 meters per second, at, let's say, somewhere around between 100 and 150 meters, that's kind of the sweet spot for where the bolt shell's going its absolute peak speed of 850 meters per second. Or 800 meters per second, depending on the variant. It is hard to make sure that happens, and anywhere beyond, I would argue, anywhere beyond 400 to 500 meters, you're going to be firing at man-sized targets. It would be hard to accurately hit a person in a specific limb or an area with the bolt shell, because the second acceleration will throw it off of your original aiming point, no matter what you intended. Just because of the volatility of rocket fuel in general, even though it might be very simple, even though it might be, not all that volatile, it is still quick enough to accelerate the bolt gun to its maximum velocity, even more so than the booster charge initially was. Because the booster charge shoots it out very quickly, but because of the weight of the shell, it is also fighting against the fact that it doesn't have a lot of expansion room. The bolt shell is huge, it can't be going that slowly. Bolters only have a certain amount of length of barrel, and beyond that, you're just wasting any acceleration you have. And the bolt shell is heavy. It's very heavy. And while that does help with its kinetic impact, it also slows the round down. Because, weight versus the impulse of its initial velocity. This is where I come into the idea that the bolt gun can't possibly be that accurate outside of a couple hundred meters. Once that rocket motor starts, any issues, any wind, any impacts, any resistance, any issues with the cartridge, any issues with the ignition of the rocket. For, of course, if a rocket is robust enough to be fired out of a bullet, it must be pretty tough. Yes, but that doesn't mean that it's perfect. And in many cases, I wouldn't be surprised if bolt shells ended up yawing or twisting, especially because the rocket motors are angled to continue to spin the round, ostensibly for stabilization. The problem is if the rockets don't start at the same speed, if they start at different times, if one of them burns out quicker than the other, the bolt shell will quickly lose its stability and begin changing direction. So outside of, I would say, somewhere around 200 meters or 250 meters, the bolt gun is no longer pinpoint accurate. Now, I'm sure this can be modified, and in fact, for more of the variants we'll talk about later, we will have, what could be changed on the bolt round to change this. Especially the Stalker bolter actually tends to have its own bullets, which are different, and in my opinion, they just do away with the whole rocket thing in general, and just put it into a standard round. Or they might have some sort of combined version, but the reason why I say, and a lot of people have an issue with, is that I claim that the bolt gun does not have a great amount of accuracy outside of a couple hundred meters. Because of the initial shoot, because of the initial low velocity, and the dramatic increase in velocity from the rocket motor, and the theoretical defects of any bullet and any round that interacts with such an explosive exit into the world, it's going to have issues with that, not even to mention recoil, which the bolter has in remarkable spades. So, again, just all the ideas of hitting targets at 500 meters with the bolt gun with any level of accuracy, throw them out. It's not going to happen. It really isn't. I hate to say it, but the bolt gun is not going to be an accurate weapon outside of 400 meters, and it's not going to be a very effective weapon outside of 700 meters. It's going to slow down, it's going to start to tumble, it's going to have issues with its penetration and velocity. It simply doesn't have the ability to go to the distance in exchange for all of the advantages that it does give you in being a 20mm grenade launcher that you can hold in your hands with armor-piercing tip. So let's go on to issues with innovation. This is when I was talking about the 3 effects. The first one is what I like to call the Belisarius Call effect. This is the idea that 40k authors and 40k as a genre tends to forget certain things when design is really on the table. Belisarius Call is a tech priest who invented several different types of bolt gun. New types of bolt gun, heavy bolt guns, variants that used much larger bolts and different types and designs of bolts, and was able to do so and produce and equip large numbers of Space Marines with them in an unbelievably short amount of time. Now that in and of itself has some issues, which I'm sure we'll discuss at a later date. The real issue with this is the idea that for almost 10,000 years, the Imperium of Man, with all of its technology, all of its capabilities, and all of its many, many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of tech priests, many of which are better designers than Call, all of them failed to see what this one gentleman was capable of doing and what he had done. Now, there are many arguments on many sides of this issue. I will not dip my toes into them right now. But for the reason of the Call effect, which is the idea that regression of technology within the Imperium has come to an end with the coming of new lore to sell new models, effectively. But with the coming of new lore, the idea of the degradation of technology has come to an end. I'm going to put that to bed right now. When I discuss the bolter, when I discuss any technology or weaponry, I will be using the established lore that was extant from 30k and extant until the end of the 41st millennium. So, when I talk about lore, when I discuss a lot of stuff, it's going to be before the opening of the eye. If I touch upon more modern items, it will be the ones that have acceptable or logical amounts of lore that I can analyze. One of the things that I have with the Call effect, and this also comes in with the Space Marine effect, the Space Marine effect is essentially the idea that anything that a Space Marine touches is just going to be good, no matter what. It's the best thing available. Everyone should be using it, and if they can't, boo-hoo for them, essentially. These two together have brought the new bolt guns into an era where they don't have the ability for people to critique them because you just write the words better than X, and it's accepted at face value. So the blank new call bolt gun is better than the old bolt gun. End of statement. That is what I have an issue with. I couldn't care less. If they want to come up with great designs or things like that, I'm all on board for it. I really would just like to have more lore on these before I do a full video on the intercessor bolter, the carbine, the heavy bolt rifle, all of that stuff, because it takes extant lore and essentially just says, well, it's better because. And there really is no logical reason for that because, a lot of which is just because with the Call effect and the Space Marine effect together, Call says that the old lore about degradation doesn't matter. Space Marine effect means that cool things that Space Marine use are cool, which means accept it, no reason to question. Now, I don't judge anyone who believes either of those things. I am still absolutely on board. I'm a big fan of all the lore. I'm glad we have it. I'm glad that there's improvement. I'm glad that they're still writing about it, and I'm all on board for that. But you gotta understand that when I analyze these things, I have to analyze them from the longest possible view, and the call pattern weapons and the modern pattern bolt weapons sometimes just don't have enough material for me to work from. I mean, just look at this slide. Look at how much I was able to gather from movies, from animations, from real life, from fan things that people have made. It is not yet time for me to be capable as a responsible person to give you a lore video on something that I can't reasonably explain to you. Something that just says it's better because it's newer doesn't make sense in 40k. Outright. Outright. I'll just say it. Because it's supposed to be the age of innovation is long gone. But that's all I'll say about that. And the final one is more of a traditional issue with the bolter, which is author power creep. Now, this happens when a new Space Marine author, I'm not going to name any names, I have many names, believe me, when a new Space Marine author takes on a new chapter, or takes on a new warband, or wherever it may be, and they just want to write some pure bolter appreciation content. They want to write a battle scene that's epic, and they want their Marine to be a man's man, down-to-earth nobody until he does something cool, and they give him the fabled bolt gun. And he just wrecks house. He shoots a Chaos Space Marine and he dies with the bolt gun. And he doesn't take a step to say, wait, why did that happen? Hold up. Why could he do that? There's no real consideration of the bolt gun has limitations with these people. These writers just pretend like the bolt gun has infinite power and absolutely no equivalence or no no flaws at all. This is 40k. All of the weapons have flaws. All of the weapons come from an era that we don't understand. All of the designs have problems. Even the bolt gun. So that's what I mean by power creep. One author does that, then another one has to top him, then another one has to go on top of him, then another one has to go here, and before long, we're talking about brand new heavy intercessor assault bolt, light machine gun bolt guns that fire the same thing but don't fire the same thing, and they're better just because it's a slippery slope that we've been going down for almost 3.5 years now at the time of writing. So, just going to put that there. So when I talk about how the bolter works, I'm going to be talking about how the bolter works and not how about the quote-unquote bolter works. So, new lore, not ignored. I've acknowledged it. It's there. I appreciate it. We'll get to it when they flesh it out a little better, when I can get some cutaways, when I can get some designs, when I can get some numbers, which I have for the old bolt guns, but not for the new ones. When I get some numbers, when I get some solid information that makes sense, and why that is the case, then I will do that. I promise. Once somebody can show me some acceptable information about that, I'll do it. So, moving on. Sorry that took so long. I had to do it because I have so many people I've gone over the bolter with that I had to talk about it. Non-standard variants of pistols. I had so many people asking me, "What are you gonna do for the bolter video? What variants are you gonna talk about? What versions are you gonna talk?" All of them. I'm doing all of them. I promise. I said this is gonna be a long video. We're gonna do all of them. So, non-dependent pistol patterns. What do I mean by non-dependent? Now, non-dependency essentially means that it doesn't matter what pattern it is. The bolt pistol doesn't have to share a pattern with the bolt rifle made on the same Forge World. In theory, many bolt pistols do have the same pattern as their Forge counterparts. However, it is not a necessary fact that a bolt pistol must be of the same pattern or even resemble the bolt gun produced on the same world. Matter of fact, some worlds only produce bolt pistols and do not produce bolt rifles because they are larger and more complex. Now, the bolt pistol works off of almost the same concept as the bolter, just make it smaller, essentially. It has a smaller 10 to 15 round magazine. It has a shorter barrel. It has a much more compact recoil mechanism, which makes the bolt pistol almost have worse recoil than the bolt gun itself, because the bolt pistol fires the same ammunition with less weight to hold it down. So it has that issue of it's smaller, but it's the same. So similar design, just miniaturized, and with the issue of, it doesn't need to have fully automatic fire, it can be less robust, but they are still heavy, etc. So let's go through. Why are X and Y different? So this comes in when we talk about bolt gun patterns that are from different legions, from different eras, from different Forge Worlds. Why are X and Y different? Why is the Phobos different from the Tigris? Why is the Ultima Godwin different from the Umbra? Why are the modern versions different from all the others? And it really just comes down to minor changes in the design, the manufacturing process, and some occasional differences in terms of modularity and how easy they are to modify. In general, there is no functional difference between Tigris, Phobos, Godwin, Type 3, etc. They all have the bolt shell, which has its own issues, as we talked about, and its own design, which really operates almost independent of whatever weapon it's firing out of. Oh, and by the way, when I talk about bolt pistols, there's likely a chance that the shells from them are firing differently or possibly a different caliber. I consider them the same, but that's not a guarantee. That's just my opinion. In fact, it would make sense either way. And it is also possible that certain shells are meant to fire or accelerate at different speeds or at different times. I was just giving a reference for a standard. So that's what you work off of for that. So, in general, X and Y, they're not really all that different. The older bolt guns work just as well as the new ones. And there really isn't much of a difference because they're all firing bolt shells for the most part. And those work pretty independently of the weapon. Mastercrafting and beauty. Is older better? So, like I just said, an Umbra pattern or some super old pattern from the Heresy days isn't necessarily better. And in many cases it might be worse in terms of, like, keeping it repaired and in one piece, and it might be, have specific requirements and be hard to modify or fix. The Mechanicus might be like, we don't know how to support that one anymore, etc., whatever it may be. But mastercrafted weapons are different, and I'll be talking about mastercrafted bolt guns for a while. Mastercrafting for the bolt gun really does matter a lot. There's a couple of reasons why. One, the en-suite electronics of the bolt gun are made for targeting. They can make you more accurate. They can help with attaching to your auto senses as on Astartes and your heads-up display as a human. So in that case, they're better. But also, mastercrafted bolt guns tend to have something special about them. Whether it's the ammunition that they use, the firing modes that they have, the durability, robustness, or attachments on them, or sometimes just the beauty of the weapon. A lot of the older bolt guns are going to be more idiosyncratic, more unique, and have different designs that might be novel in comparison to the newer ones. moving on. Attachments and minor variants. Well, somebody last time asked me about the Stalker bolter with so much vehemence that I was concerned about even making this video without talking about the Stalker ostensibly, and I have an entire other slide for you. I promise. I'm gonna go through these pictures in a bit too. So, the Stalker is essentially just the sniper or the DMR version of the bolt gun. It has semi-automatic fire, it has a longer barrel, and that's when I talk about it might have a different round. It likely has a different round that is meant to accelerate more out of the barrel and accelerate using the rocket motor for longer to increase the velocity of the round and to ensure much greater accuracy than the standard bolter has, losing its kind of pinpoint or effective infantry weapon accuracy at around 500 meters. Might lose some of its accuracy at 400 or even less, but 500 you're definitely not going to be aiming at, specific targets anymore. You're going to be aiming at man-sized targets with several bolts, or you're going to be aiming at crowds, groups, etc. Finally, bayonets, and we'll get into that in a second, but they're not only blade bayonets for the bolt gun, they're chain bayonets for the bolt gun, which is cool. Whether they're efficient, effective, or not, cool factor, man. There's no reason to not have it. It does increase the weight of the weapon, so as a mortal, I wouldn't do it. That's heavy. And also, why would I stab someone with my incredibly expensive special weapon that I ordered special from Mars? Like, for a mortal, it would kind of defeat the purpose of having this extremely expensive weapon if I was just going up and stabbing people with it. As cool as it is, and as much as I love the 40k prevailing addiction to stabbing things with sharp weapons that often have chainsaws attached, it is not a necessity to have one, and the ones that do have them tend to be for forces that want them or have them for ceremonial purposes. For example, there are Terax bolters, which are used for the Sisters of Silence, that have a sarissa or a curved scimitar-like blade on the end. And of course, this lovely Night Lord's bolt gun with its axe-like chain bayonet, which is very cool. Remodels and true variants. So, as I mentioned before, innovation and change with the bolt gun is very hard. The design and the round limits innovation and really does limit how much change you can make to the design before it kind of just doesn't work anymore. But the remodels and the true variants, all of the patterns and the modifications, including things like the combi bolter and the storm bolter, etc., I would argue are remodels. They take a concept that was working and either double it up or pair it with another working concept, as is a lot of the technology in 40k. And then finally, the true variants. The true variants are bolt cannons and what I call false bolt cannons. So up here, and I'll start with these over here, is the Mars pattern recoil suppressor on the Super Titan caliber Mega Bolter. I think it's a Vulcan Mega Bolter, if I remember right. But this is a Warhound Titan's gun that fires the equivalent of that .95 caliber or even 40 millimeter bolt shell. And these have remarkably good range, great effect on target, but the real thing is they fire at an ungodly speed. Being a heavy caliber minigun, they are incredibly destructive. They can delete medium or light vehicles, they can severely wound things like knights, they can mess up space marines. In effect, firing a lot of these high caliber mass reactive bolt rounds. By the way, when it says mass reactive on a bolt round, really it just means that it's fused and it's designed to penetrate using that diamantite tip. So mass reactive just means that it's hitting and then exploding. With the goal being that it hits, penetrates, and then explodes, but it can also just hit and then explode, which happens often when it hits tough armor. It will hit, trigger the explosion, and detonate before actually penetrating, dealing relatively little damage because the actual explosive inside of the bolt shell is relatively low. Now we get to what I call the Abomination. The Abomination, and the second Abomination, which I have on the next slide, is a combi bolter, which is the concept of, I like this pistol and or rifle, I want to attach it to my bolt gun. This one just happens to be one of the cursed things that man has ever laid their eyes upon. On the bottom is a plasma gun, with the coils going the wrong way, and the entire heatsink fused directly beneath the barrel of the bolt gun. And then the magazine is all the way back here. I have no idea what type of black magic is used to get bolt shells from this buttstock into the bolt gun, but bullpupping the bolt gun would definitely fall under tech heresy, in my opinion. And this is a sin against God, and the God Emperor, and the Chaos Gods. This is bad, and whatever Marine uses it should likely be shot with it multiple times before it's lit on fire. It also has absolutely no extraction port, unless it's on the other side, which is stupid, because how are you going to get the brass out of this thing? But either way, let's ignore the abomination for now, because sometimes people get too creative with the designs that they have for weapons, and we call those people earnest. Moving up top, we have what looks like a Phobos pattern with an attached combi melta, one of the cool options. You'll see a lot of combi weapons that are either two bolt guns slapped together to increase the amount of bolt per bolt that you fire from your bolt gun, or it attaches an armor-piercing weapon to the bolt gun, so that when your bolt gun doesn't do enough damage to armor, which is often going to be the case, you have an absolutely horrifying anti-armor weapon attached to it. In this case, it's a melta-gun. I'll do a video on melta-guns. They're relatively short range. The downside of attaching a secondary weapon to the bolter is not only does it drastically increase the weight of the weapon, it decreases its accuracy by drawing its weight to one side, and it also decreases the ammunition capacity of the other weapon. So a combi weapon might have half to even a quarter of its actual fuel capacity or ammunition capacity compared to a standard weapon of that type. Then we have a lovely Night Lord Umbra pattern with its chain bayonet. God, I love this thing. This is one of my favorite pieces of art in 40k by a long shot, because you know damn well that a Night Lord intentionally put the chain blade on it just to be scary. Just to be frightening and unsettling, and I love that so much. I am a big Night Lords fan. So, cool. Umbra pattern with a chain blade. Awesome. Another lovely Phobos pattern. Honestly, a great one. And the Phobos have... that might not be a Phobos. That might be a different one, but I think it's Phobos. Have sometimes these circular drums, which can hold like 45 rounds, maybe a little bit less, maybe a little bit more. But this one has a plasma gun attached to it. You know, like the Abomination, just not as horrible because it's mounted correctly on the side of the weapon. Now, previous slide continued. Like I said, I'm going over all the bolt weapons in this video, all that I have an opportunity to do. As mentioned before, the bolt pistol, in this case a Godwin Ultima, which in my opinion is a beautiful gun. The Godwin Ultima bolt pistol, it really is just the bolt gun squeezed into a smaller package. A lot of Marines use this as a sidearm. Some Assault Marines use it as a primary ranged weapon, because their other hand is busy with a chainsword or some other melee weapon. The bolt pistol is even less accurate than the bolt gun, and it's got a severely restricted range and a restricted magazine capacity, and it is also only limited to semi-automatic fire. So, bolt pistol's not terrible. Some people say that they're a lower caliber. I would accept that, honestly. I just haven't seen any proof to the pro or con of it being a higher or lower caliber. It has even higher recoil than the bolter, obviously because of its decreased weight and less things holding it down. Then we have these two storm bolters over here. This one is a little bit grainy, but it's got a box magazine. So, what is the box magazine? Since this storm bolter is two bolters effectively stuck together with a lot of the recoil stuff, you know, you can see it here, that recoil spring that goes back into the section housing. It's very hard to see. This is very grainy, but you can look up this image elsewhere. There's a lot of mechanics in here, electricals, things like that hook up to the HUD. There's a blast compensator in place of the longer barrel. But the storm bolter is heavy, but it's still not heavy enough to resist recoil. So the Storm Bolter fires at insane rates of fire because it has two barrels, but it also has a lower magazine capacity and unbelievably stubby barrels. So the range of the Storm Bolter is on par with that of the Bolt Pistol. Obviously, it doesn't matter at a certain point because the bolts are going to accelerate themselves, but it does matter for accuracy. And having two barrels next to each other is always bad for accuracy. So the issues with the Storm Bolter are really bad accuracy, low magazine capacity considering the speed of the weapon. It generally only fires on fully automatic. At least I have never seen it fire semi-auto. I'm sure you could tap the trigger, but since it is only one trigger firing two barrels, it may fire both barrels. It may fire them in sequence. In fact, that's most likely. But in either case, the Storm Bolter tends to be used by Space Marine Terminators or by Space Marines who really, really don't need to use their other hand. Because what you need to do with the Storm Bolter, if you're not a Terminator and you don't have the weight and the strength in your armor to resist its recoil, or at least guide its recoil, I'm not going to pretend that a Terminator can just raise the Storm Bolter at shoulder level and just fire it with one hand. It will still recoil and draw their arm away. But if a Marine tried to do that, they would get maybe 3 rounds on target before they're aiming at the sky. What you want to do with the combi bolters, which are 2 bolters stuck together, or with the Storm Bolter, the combi bolter can be a little bit more modifiable. You can fire them each individually, or you can fire them, both fully automatic. Combi bolter essentially discounts Storm Bolter, but it has different lengths of barrel. There's kind of controversy about that. I don't really care. I like the combi bolter because it's cooler. I don't like the Storm Bolter as much because it's less accurate and it fires at an unnecessary speed most of the time. Tyranids, again, always a good reason to have insane fire rate. But if you're a normal Marine and you want to use a Storm Bolter, you're going to either want to brace it against yourself, so grab the top cover and use your Auspex to fire it, kind of getting a 2-hand grip, one above the barrels and one on the trigger, bracing it against your chest if you want to really hold the same point of aim, or more likely, just keep to bursts of 10 to 20 rounds. Like a heavy machine gun or like a light machine gun, you don't want to just rip away with it because if you keep it to bursts of 10 rounds, you get 3 bursts out of it. And considering that the bolt gun is very effective at penetrating weak spots in armor or overcoming weak armor, you don't necessarily need to rip a whole 60 rounds into your opponents for them to, get the hint, essentially. It really only takes a burst of 10 before you can be pretty sure that whatever you fired at, unless it's in power armor, unless it's in power armor, basically, or is a vehicle, has got the message. Edge cases of firing and issues with velocity aside, and bad accuracy, of course, it's a very effective weapon for suppressing crowds of medium armored and below enemies, and for blasting down enemies who are more armored, but you want to kill them via unfortunate bad hits. Let's move over to the Abomination, Mark II. So this is that 26-ish millimeter heavy bolter, except someone who probably shouldn't be allowed to touch machines anymore has attached a flamer to it. Now, there are several reasons why attaching a flamethrower to any weapon is a terrible idea, and I understand that this is usually used by both Marines and the Death Watch, who are the insane Xenos-hating, subchapter of the Marines, but yet again, I would like to circle here the Abomination. It's bad. It's really bad. It's a handheld heavy bolter, which can look cool, but it's been unceremoniously mated to a flamethrower. And in my opinion, this is an accident waiting to happen. You have a high recoil, heavy weapon attached to a short-range, anti-structure and anti-horde weapon. The heavy bolter would do better than the flamer on its own, so I genuinely don't understand why this exists, and it hurts my eyes that it does exist. Whatever tech priest is responsible for this existing should be thrown into space without an oxygen mask or any suit. So, that's enough of the Abomination Mark II. Moving over to what is not the Abomination, and might be one of the coolest guns that I've ever seen. This is from the front of the Dark Heresy book. It is a heavy bolter that a Black Legionary has modified so that he's holding it like a light machine gun. He has a paddle trigger in the back to help with his big old beef fingers being able to pull the trigger, and he has a vertical foregrip, but not in the place that you'd think. It's not underneath the barrel. No, he has a vertical foregrip, as in sticking off the top of the gun, and he's bracing it with his hip and firing this thing like he's holding a very large guitar and firing a heavy bolter at the same time. This is very innovative. This is very cool. Now you might say, oh, wait, there's no modification of the heavy bolter. Note, this isn't actually a modification of the heavy bolter itself. Everything in this picture is exactly the same as any other heavy bolter. This and this are the same picture, minus a couple of pieces. All that he did is essentially tie a string from the pistol grip that is on most heavy bolters, like this one up here, and he tied it to this paddle, and effectively he's just toggled the trigger to fire at a different angle. This is a genius plan for taking a, heavy weapon that is effective against all types of different targets and turning it into an infantry portable one, granted one that you're going to need power armor to use. So, very, very cool. I am a huge fan of this design. It's awesome. Moving on, we have the far more standard, and in my opinion, the most common heavy support weapon in the Imperium of Man. Barring the heavy stubber, and if we're going into just the Imperial Guard, in my opinion, the heavy bolter is the most common weapon found in the Imperial Guard. Now, these look like 40mm shells, but again, 26, maybe 30mm is going to be more accurate. These gentlemen are doing what I would call the average Teamster deal, which is one is feeding and loading, and the other one is firing. Notice, the heavy bolter needs a massive reinforced housing, a gun pavis for the gunner. He's got two paddles back here that he's essentially aiming the gun with his waist, and that's because of its extreme weight. That's because of its extreme weight and the fact that it is on a tripod. Now, the heavy bolter is light enough, maybe not in this configuration because it looks like it's got an extra bunch of stamped steel on it as some sort of housing, but it is light enough that it can be moved by a team of 3 or 4. I would say maybe 2 if it was a cut-down version like this one, and just had like a tripod that could snap off. One dude grabs the tripod and the ammunition, the other guy grabs the bolter itself, and they hump it to the next position. But it is still a heavy weapon. It is not something that anyone other than a certain Catachan, whose model is very cool, whose name I have again forgotten. I'm very sorry to the person who gave me that name in the last in the last video. But don't assume that the heavy bolter is an infantry weapon. It generally isn't. Even Marines, as you can see here, have to modify it to use it effectively. But infantrymen love it. It has huge hitting power. It's great against medium armored enemies. Even against enemies whose armor it can't penetrate, it can mess them up through sheer kinetic impact, and the heavy bolter having more explosive power than the normal bolter, the explosion, even if it doesn't hurt them, can cause more damage through kinetic impact. Shockwave, things like that. It can stun people, it can suppress. It's great at penetrating structures, low walls, defenses, etc., raking enemy positions. And the other thing is, unlike the bolter and the specialty bolter variants, it's dirt cheap and really, really available. This is one of the few situations where the heavy weapon variant of an IG weapon, of an Imperial Guard weapon, is both cheaper and more available than the normal variant, which I would consider the bolt gun to be. So you would almost think that the heavy bolter has some sort of, cheapness to it, or, common weapons are bad and they're, made of cheaper materials, which heavy bolters tend to be pretty good. In general, they're not made to the same quality standard, and a lot of them are made on war worlds or industrial worlds just because they're bigger, simpler. They work more like a heavy machine gun than a recoil-operated weapon. They require, a lot more internal machining parts, but less hard calibration, and less high-tech components, and less high expense components. So, the heavy bolter's probably just made out of steel. Whole thing, internals, all of it. Whereas the bolt gun has to be integrated, it's got to have electronics, it's got to have an adamantium spring and gibbet and all this kind of fancy stuff made out of fancy materials. Heavy bolter? Nah. Most expensive thing on the heavy bolter is probably the ammo. Because it still has the armor-piercing head with the same issues. And then finally, a lovely Tigris Stalker bolter. Now, there's some funny things about the Stalker bolter. It is essentially a bolt gun. No real changes there. That you've screwed an extra 100% of barrel onto. So between the chamber here and the barrel is maybe 12 inches, and then you've added on 14 inches of extra barrel. So you have more than doubled the length of barrel, and you have increased the size of the round in many cases. So it hits harder, it hits further, it has better accuracy, and it has a much better system for range finding. That big old scope at the top, the Marines not necessarily, they don't have to look through that. It essentially integrates with their auspex. Not always the case. I'm sure there are some who are using more classic electronic sights, like the Imperial Guard do, but it's not necessary. Marines have all of that stuff in their helmets. And with the automated targeter that is, inherent to a majority of bolt weapons, they don't really need the sight. The sight is just there kind of as a placeholder, and it holds extra electronics that make its accuracy even better. Helps the Marine see even further, helps him compensate for the weapon, because the Stalker bolt rifle is different in terms of its mechanics, its ammunition, its range, and how it behaves to a degree in comparison to the bolt gun. And finally, of course, it lacks any fully automatic fire capability, but y'all knew that. On to one of the last slides. That took us a bit, didn't it? Users, importance, and logistics. Over here we have Our Lady Fair, a Adeptus Sororitas with her looks like a Godwin Diaz, might be some variant of the Godwin Diaz. We have our Chaos Blood-Pact Soldier with his ensorcelled chainsword and his, elite bolt gun, and there's a gentleman over here with another bolt gun, and what looks like maybe a Hell Pistol or a Auto Pistol over here, but this is clearly an elite Cornet Traitor Guard regiment. Maybe they're Blood-Pact. I'm pretty sure they're Blood-Pact, especially because they have their hands out and their scars are showing. And then we have the shoulder-mounted heavy bolter with that kind of paddle-style trigger. And this is, again, where I talk about, it can be put on other stuff. So when we go to... let's go through the users. PDF. PDF will only ever use the heavy bolter. They will not get their hands on bolt pistols or bolt guns unless there are high-ranking officials like generals, nobles, planetary governors, who managed to buy a specific example from a Forge World and keep it for personal protection, if nothing else. What they will use is heavy bolters, either for vehicles like the Valkyrie and other certain AA weapons and certain flyable vehicles if they have an Air Force, or if they have, vehicles in their hangars and starports that can be used for planetary defense. They will often be equipped with the heavy bolter, and when they're not, they're going to be equipped with autocannons or multi-lasers. What they will use more commonly is heavy bolters on pintles on occasion. These are going to be pretty rare. They're going to be limited to, the tops of the spire might have one or two heavy bolter positions. But the other one that is common among the PDF, especially on Mechanicus worlds, Forge worlds, and some War worlds and Fortress worlds, are servitors that are equipped with heavy bolters. They'll have carriages, they'll have ammunition, and they will have automatic targeting, and the PDF will learn to fight alongside them and use their threat detection to identify and kill targets, in conjunction with this heavy weapon on wheels, essentially. Chaos. Chaos views bolt guns. For Chaos Space Marines, obviously, it's the standard weapon. It's what they want. It deals with a lot of different targets. It kind of overmatches and scares. The other thing is a lot of it is psychological to a degree. You don't want to be in the way of the bolt gun, because if you don't have heavy armor, you don't have a high chance of living. And even if you do have heavy armor, most people are scared of taking a direct bolt gun shot, even if they might survive it. most people don't want to risk broken ribs or deafened ears or ripped off fingers, limbs, etc., just because they feel gutsy today. On the other hand, while Chaos may fear it, they also revere the bolt gun. Because a lot of warbands are reliant upon Chaos Space Marines, they see the bolt gun as kind of that ultimate elevation. It is a sign that someone has entered the upper ranks of the elite to have a bolt weapon. And while heavy bolters are more common for Chaos, because of course they are more common for the rest of the Imperial Guard, and grabbing them from the Guard is not all that uncommon, the ammunition is also fairly common in comparison to the ammunition used for standard bolters. Yet still, it is an elite weapon. It isn't really given out in general to troops unless they're the ultimate elite or the ultimate storm, and even then, it's an officer's weapon. So, storm units, elite bodyguards and protectors, and of course, demagogues. Now, very common here is bolt pistols, because they are, more concealable, less heavy. They can be very effective while not sacrificing a lot in terms of weight in comparison to the standard bolt gun or the heavy bolter. Guardsmen, as mentioned, it's common. Very common. It's one of the most common support weapons in the Imperium. Bolters, not heavy bolters, but bolters are not actually unheard of within the Imperial Guard. High officers, commissars, and even sergeants who kind of distinguish themselves and have some good money and pedigree behind them might get their hands on a bolt gun or a bolt pistol of the Godwin, Diaz, or a similar .60 rather than .75 caliber round. Now, these are hard to manufacture, or harder to get a hold of, harder to get ammo for, etc., but it really is beyond compare the amount of respect and honor that can come to somebody who has a bolt gun. The las pistol is not a great killing weapon. It doesn't have a huge amount of punch behind it, and it's really not like, I hate to say it, but it is not a very masculine choice, the las pistol. Auto pistols and revolvers, a little bit more on the scary, spooky side. They have a lot of recoil, a lot of give to them, and while the las pistol is the most efficient option, a lot of them favor the bolt pistol for its sheer ability to put people down. And, what is more, it has the ability to theoretically threaten enemies that are way outside of your comfort zone. So, if you're fighting Xenos, if you're fighting Marines, the bolt gun is not as much of a threat as we've discussed to power armor, but it isn't a non-threat. And especially because of that secondary explosion, which is really what the bolt is made for, it's meant to penetrate and then detonate, that secondary explosion, that's what you can kind of count on to really do the damage. And that's why Chaos Forces and Imperial Forces value it for dealing with Space Marines. Because, the chance that you get a lucky shot in, even if it's like a full-auto bolt gun, may not be high. But if you do it, it isn't like a las gun where, I've just dealt a little bit of damage, I've done some scorch marks, I've made him bleed, or I've shoved some shrapnel into him. It can be a genuine killing shot. It has a chance to actually penetrate a weak spot, enter the Marine, damage his armor, and then detonate, not only gutting parts of his armor, but also shredding flesh, muscle, debilitating limbs, and hurting internal organs. So it is very important to both of these forces as it really gives them a lot of confidence, it frightens both their enemies and allies, and it is a status symbol for the ability, theoretical as it may be, to damage and kill enemies far above their weight level. Now, moving on, a little bit more complicated are Psi Cannons and the Chaos Bolter. Now, the Chaos Bolter, apart from the whole fact of, Chaos tends to cobble things together, they make stuff that doesn't make sense, they make weapons that aren't of any pattern, and they just kind of mix and match bits and bobs. This can be bad, can be good. If it's in a warband or a Chaos Space Marine warband that doesn't have a lot of access to high technology or to those who are skilled in using such high technology, it can be like, haha, your bolter's semi-auto and it barely works and it jams a lot. That's on the negative side. On the positive side of things, your bolter has a demon inside of it and it turns all of your bolt shells into, super armor-piercing plasma-coated rounds like Psi Cannons do, or like the Thousand Suns bolters are, the Psi bolts. They're like crackly blue lightning bolts. All of that stuff really does come into effect with these types of weapons. When you can have improvements or modifications that are based upon a specific force or their ability to use certain psychic powers, for example. Grey Knights and Thousand Suns stand out here. The bolter is robust enough, unlike las guns and auto guns. Sometimes, there are exceptions. There are definitely demons that have been stuck into all types of weapons, but the bolt gun is big enough and robust enough that it can be used to work sorceries upon, blessings upon, inhabit with demons, force chaos corruption into, whatever it may be. And that's when we go into Mastercrafting Part 2 and Relics. So, Mastercrafting Part 2 really just talks about what can be done to make the bolter better. And what part of this, along with the Relics, is specialty ammunition. There's special ammo that fires like mutagenic acid that melts through Tyranids. There are special ammunition that is specifically armor piercing. Kraken bolts, for example, are specifically made to penetrate armor. Internal logic aside, problems with those bolts aside, there are definitely options that you can use to improve the bolt gun. Yet more examples of how the bolt gun isn't just a perfect weapon for any thing is that during the Heresy, bolt guns had a very hard time penetrating armor, and so they created both new bolt guns and new bolt gun rounds, and mastercrafting and things like that, to improve those things. So it wasn't like they just said, well, let's just bolt them harder. They actually went out and made a difference and changed how they were working at it. So that's how the mastercrafting works in that case. Improving, proving that it isn't perfect. We can always get better. And in our small way, not in full redesigns, but in a small way. And relics. Relic bolt guns are kind of limited to weapons that are so storied and ancient that they have names and legends attached to them, and those ones have some sort of holy or chaos affiliation, some sort of change in them worked in and about the warp that affects the standard, bolt gun to do things like, it banishes demons, or, it pierces through armor as if it weren't even there, or, any of these hyperbolic, clearly chaos or God Emperor Kajigiri affected weaponry that is bopping around the Imperium every now and then. This happens a lot more on the side of Chaos, but when it happens on the Imperium side of things, it tends to be stronger. So a Sororitas bolter who's like, yes, the saint herself used this bolt gun. It's a holy relic of our order, and it will slay any demon that dare come. That is rarer than the Chaos Space Marine or the Chaos Warrior who just goes, this is my bolt gun, Heartsbane. It rips out people's hearts. That's the thing that it does. That's what it does. Doesn't necessarily have to be true. Might be lying. Who knows? When they say relics, it's sometimes real. It's sometimes just not for Chaos. So, finishing up with the elephant in the room. We've already gone over Call. We've already gone over Space Marine 2. We've already gone over the new bolter rules. Really, I have to say, I need to wait. You guys are super good for asking me to do it. I'll go over Call in another video once I go into his lore a little bit more. The more I go and I run into the lore research, because I've done this for many years now, taking the logical view and the rational understanding of how these military arms and armors might work, and how they might stack up against one another, using logic rather than lore necessarily, because, where lore doesn't serve us, logic must stand. Call in Space Marine 2, Call, one thing in himself, he's an entire effect upon the lore system, which people have either accepted or not accepted. It has driven a wedge between the group of people who, have a preference, who don't have a preference. I don't care. I like the lore how it is. I'm fine with additions to it, but I just need more information before I go and make a whole video about it. This is my bolter video, as I said. Space Marine 2, it's a video game. Like all video games, and especially ones for 40k, it exaggerates some cases, devalues others, has differences in it. I really like the game. I've played it. I've played Darktide. I've played all the different 40k games. Came in, some of them come in for a fair bit of slagging, like they don't, perfectly fit in with this, or like, the lore doesn't say that. I'm not really that particular about it. It's a game. I appreciate it. I like the weapons from it. I've gone into some of them here, and in many cases I've gone into their predecessors here. In terms of, like, what does this heavy weapon do? What does that do? Keep that for future videos. I will do Primaris Space Marine videos and Space Marine videos in general, but understand that I am working my way up, and the reason that I'm doing that is because a lot of it has lore issues. So the quote-unquote new bolter rules and the lore issues are connected. I need more things to be written and more information to be publicly available, analyzed by different factions, and approved by different people before I can go ahead and feel comfortable saying, this is how it is. This is how it isn't. Either way, that's just what I have to do. If you have an issue with that, please stick with me. Talk about it, comment about it, whatever you have to do. So, I've talked on long enough. I know I've talked your ears off. So, acknowledgements. Celebrate the good times. Come on. Y'all are so great. I'm so glad I got the Bolter video out. Thank you so much for 100 plus subs. I was at 119, I think, when I started this, and I was at 20 a week ago. And you guys have been awesome. I cannot believe that I've gotten so much done in so little time with how busy I am. And I intend to do much more. This is just the start. This is just the hard stuff. I'm getting this out of the way so I can do more fun videos. Maybe I'll stream. Maybe I'll do other stuff. I'd love to do games. Talk about 40k lore while I'm playing a game or something like that. If I can set it up or figure it out. I'd like to hear what you guys have to say. Disclaimer, obviously, this is all my stuff. This is how I interpret the lore. I know that a lot of people disagree with me on this. I'd love to hear your disagreements. It will do nothing but make my lore better and make me more understanding of what people think and what people believe. But it's also an opportunity for me to spread, the idea of we can be enjoyers of this genre and still use logical rationale and still use, rationalizations to understand the space between real technology, real military strategy versus 40k lore and the larger than life. I was never one who accepted the larger than life. Everything's larger than life. Everything is, over the top. It doesn't have to be. That was always my belief. It doesn't have to be. We can always do better to try and understand, and in my opinion, that makes it more enjoyable. When I have something to chew on, when I really know the numbers, when I know the effectiveness and I can gauge how people engage with the fiction and how people interact with it, what they believe, I have more fun that way. Whether I'm playing the tabletop, playing a video game, analyzing lore, a book, whatever, as long as I'm doing that, I tend to have more fun. You can give your opinion on that as much as you like, but that realism to me is what has made up a majority of the hobby. And filling in the gaps really is my absolute greatest pleasure, and I would love to continue doing that for you all. So upcoming videos that are coming on, as I mentioned, I will be doing Power Armor next. I'll be doing a lot about Power Armor. Probably won't be as long of a video because I'm going to cover the marks quickly, guys. I'm not doing this level of detail for all the Power Armors. Like 50% of them are all the same exact thing. Almost all of them have similar or sometimes just the same level of protection. But I'll go into some lore. I'll go over them. I'll go over, how it's made, how it works, how to defeat it, variants on how it operates, how the Marine sees it, how he uses it, what other forces use it, etc. Standard video practice for the Power Armor. And then I was thinking I was going to go into Terminator Armor. But beyond that, I haven't cemented a decision. Obviously, I want to do melee weapons at some point, but I'd really like to know your guys' opinion on what videos you would like next. Again, I haven't forgotten that one guy who said he wanted to do Soldier Kit, and I've been keeping it, on the nose for the moment. But, whatever happens, I wish you all a lovely night.